Kids make their way to the door. Here we are on this Sunday after Easter. Crowds have dwindled just a little bit. That typically happens, right? Everybody comes to church on Easter. But Easter really is, isn't it, a high point in the life of the church. As we gathered last week to celebrate the risen Christ, certainly it is a big deal. And you might see the cross is still up, and you might think, well, we forgot to take the cross down from Easter, but that's not at all the case, because Easter is not just one Sunday. Did you realize that Easter is a season? It's a season that begins on Resurrection Sunday, but it lasts all the way until Pentecost Sunday, which is on June the 4th this year. And many times we will, as a congregation, follow through the lectionary passages through the season of Easter. But this year we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to veer away from those lectionary passages. And as many of you know, we're going to be heading toward a season of sabbatical this summer. My kids are probably tired of me talking about all of the plans that we're making. But we're making plans, not only my family, we're making plans for travel, but here in the congregation, we're making plans to do lots of things this summer, as Julie talked about and as Wes talked about earlier in the service. And so, as we plan toward that time, it seems appropriate that we take a few weeks to talk about our mission as a church. So the next 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about who we are as a congregation. Really a short series, just 3 weeks, but we're going to be looking forward to that. And you might be saying, well, who are we as a church? And you might remember back in 2011, we developed this mission statement that you see on your bulletins. If you look on a bulletin today, you'll see that mission statement right there on the front cover. A Spirit-led people gathered to care for and empower each other by stewarding God's resources to impact our community for Christ. Now that is a mouthful, isn't it? That's a lot of stuff. And you might remember back in 2011, Matt Headley was here. And Matt and I, along with Heather and Christy, developed the wording around that. We worked with the CCT. And you might also remember at that time, a Ball State student did some artwork in our hallway, and we spent 1 week on each of those words, and we talked about that. And that might seem like yesterday to some of you, but that seems like a long time ago. But that was in 2011. Now, as we are still going to live by that mission statement, we are still going to be a Spirit-led people. We're not going to stop doing that. We're still going to care for and empower each other. We're still going to steward God's resources to impact our community for Christ. But we're going to shift a little bit to some new words here in 2017. You see, God continues to move, doesn't He? He continues to prompt. He continues to press us in particular directions. And so we're changing the wording a little bit, changing to some new words, still doing many of the same things. But we're also going to ask the question, what is God doing this year? What is God doing now? How is God pressing us to move forward into the future? And this year, obviously, so the sabbatical has been kind of a key focus for us as church leaders this year as we're looking into 2017. And we've been discerning together, what does that mean for us? What is God calling us to do? And we wanted a phrase or a slogan or something to help us look toward that together. And so we brainstormed, and these 3 words rose to the surface. These 3 words: building, community, presence. And I remember sitting in that room and someone suggested, why don't we put a period after each word? Building, period. Community, period. Presence, period. And as we look at these words, it's not a phrase, building, community, presence. It's really 3 words that we're going to come to each word and talk about what that word means for us. And ultimately, we will do it without periods. We will build community presence. But we're also talking about these 3 distinct words. And so as we're using these new words to express God's leading for us, we're beginning to think about these words for the next 3 weeks. And we're really not going to stop talking about it. Really, throughout the whole summer, we're going to be talking about these same sorts of things, these same sorts of dynamics. But my intention is, before I leave, to bring some definition to the words, and then as we venture into the summer, we'll continue to talk about that. So this week, we're going to talk about the word building. Next week, the word community. And then on May 7th, the word presence. And then also on May 14th, which by the way is Mother's Day, we're going to continue to talk about presence as we talk about children. Certainly that is one way that God is present with us. We're going to have a special emphasis on children on that particular Sunday. But it's my hope that this will set up some understanding as we move forward. So here we go. The word building, that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. Now, you might be looking at that and be thinking, well, building is a noun, but building is also a verb. And both are very true. We're going to talk about both this morning. But let's put the definition up there first for a noun. This is what a noun, the building in terms of a noun. It's a structure with a roof and walls, such as a house, store, or factory. You might even add school, even though Webster didn't put, or you might even add church in there, even though Webster did not put church in there. The building can also be a noun in terms of the building of a highway, but I think that really points more toward the verb. You didn't know you were getting a grammar lesson this morning, did you, in church? But here's the definition of the verb form. The verb form is this: to construct something, typically something large, by putting parts or material together over a period of time. So building is a noun, and building is a verb. So what about First Baptist, you might say? Well, we have a building, right? We have a noun, a building. And our building is something special. Now let's talk about this first, and then we'll come back to the verb form. First, let's talk about building as a noun. Now there's been some discussion in recent years among church leaders about church buildings. And some people have said, well, you know, churches really don't need buildings. In fact, the early church didn't have a building. And why do we need a building today? And you might even know that there are a number of churches in Muncie that don't have buildings. They meet in the convention center. There's a church that meets at Cornerstone. There's churches that meet in schools. And some of these churches have no intention of ever building a building. And if we really explored this issue, you could make the case that the early church did not have a building. In fact, we read in Acts chapter 2, verse 46, every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. The church in the book of Acts is meeting in two places. Where are they meeting? The temple courts and in homes or houses. Now, this reminds us, doesn't it, that word temple courts, that there was a building, if you go back to the Old Testament, that signified God's presence with His people. So let's talk about buildings in terms of the Old Testament. Did God have buildings in the Old Testament? Did the people of God gather in buildings? Well, let's zoom all the way back, go all the way back to Abraham in Genesis. You might remember the story of Abraham and his sacrifice of his son Isaac, really his willingness to sacrifice Isaac. He didn't have to sacrifice him, but he was willing to do that. And he went to this place called Mount Moriah. Now, Mount Moriah was not a building, but it was a place the people of God associated with the presence of God. Look at Genesis 22:14. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. So this place, Mount Moriah, was a place that people attached with God's presence. Later, God revealed to Moses, after rescuing his people from Egyptian slavery, that there would be this tabernacle. Look at Exodus 25, verses 8 and 9. Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you. Now, that word sanctuary is a word that we still use today. We even call this room the what? Sanctuary. What does the word sanctuary mean? It means that's where God dwells, right? And so, as Moses was coming out of Egypt with the people who were freed from slavery, God said to them, I want you to build a tabernacle. Now, it was a portable building because they carried it with them. And in many ways, it signified for the people of God, it was a representative of God's dwelling in heaven. And we could spend a lot of time talking about the tabernacle. We just don't have time to do all of that this morning. But the point is that it was a building, it was a place where the people of God associated with God's presence. Now, let's keep moving fairly quickly here. You might remember there was the tabernacle, and then David comes along, and David says, why don't we build a permanent dwelling for God, right? And that permanent dwelling for God is called the what? Temple. Right. And look at 2 Samuel chapter 7. After the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." Now, it was Solomon, as we talked about a couple of years ago, that eventually built the temple. But the temple was a place where God's presence was known. But you might also remember the temple was conditional. In fact, the people of God often disobeyed God. They often did not live in relationship with Him. And God warned the people through His prophets that, look, if you guys don't stick with me, this temple is going to be a temporary sort of thing. And in 586 BC, Solomon's temple was destroyed. The people of God were carried off to this place called Babylon. Then they returned in 515 BC, and they began to rebuild the temple. Now, this second temple, about a decade before Jesus was born, it was going into this disrepair state, and Herod the Great came in, and he began to restore the temple, refurbish the temple, and even expanded the temple. But you might also remember that Jesus, often as he walked around the temple, he spoke of that temple also being destroyed. Look at Matthew 24:2. Do you see all these things, he asked? Truly I tell you, not one stone here, and Jesus is in the temple when he says this, will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. In Luke 21, Jesus said, as for what you see here, he's standing in the temple, there will be a time when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. So Jesus talked about the temple being destroyed, and sure enough, the temple was destroyed after Jesus' death and resurrection. Now, we encounter language of the temple shifting in the New Testament, and you might remember Paul taught the fact that our bodies are the temples of God, right? Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you received from God? You are not your own, you were bought with a price, therefore honor God with your bodies. And so the early church, as it expanded throughout the Roman Empire, understood that God's presence was not in a particular place, but it was with the people of God. And in fact, church buildings were not the norm for the early church. Early Christians understood God was with them wherever they went. They met in homes. They met in synagogues in many places, in many cities throughout Asia Minor. And in fact, church buildings were not even considered really before 240 AD. Scholars tell us that the very first Christian church was excavated on the Euphrates River around the year 240 AD. It was a converted house that they simply added a baptistry and another room dedicated for worship. But that particular church building was destroyed in 256 AD. So even the very earliest Christian church building did not last very long. Now, you might ask the question, well, when did churches in the terms of the people start building churches in terms of buildings? Now, the answer comes really when there was a significant shift in the year 313 AD. Now, before that time, Christianity was something that was not even really legal. It was ambiguous in terms of its being legal. People were persecuted. People were killed for being Christians. But then, in the year 313, the emperor, Constantine, became a Christian. And when the emperor became a Christian, then lots of people became Christians. Everything changed. And that's really when churches started building buildings. The great era of church buildings began with Constantine. And really, Constantine was the one who commissioned basilicas to raise up these massive church buildings that in many ways really did not serve the heart of what it meant to be a Christian, but they were there really to signify the new state religion. And so ever since 313 AD, all the way up really until recent times, church buildings have been really the norm for Christians. So why do Christians need buildings, you might say? Well, you might say, well, we need places to accommodate our worship, right? We need places to baptize people, to build a baptistry, or to administrate the things of the church. And those are not bad reasons to have a building. In fact, they're good reasons to have a building. But it is more than just that, as we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. Now, we think about this idea of a church building. We don't have to decide whether or not we want to have a church building, do we, as a church? We already have one. In fact, we have a beautiful building. And I have the opportunity many times to, as people come in the office or pastors come, sometimes we meet as a pastor's prayer group here in our church, and very often one of those pastors has never been in our building, so I always bring them in here, and as soon as they walk into this room, their jaw drops, right? They look around and they say, wow, what a building, right? We don't have to decide whether or not we want to build one. We already have one. I hear comments often like, well, they don't build churches like this anymore. Or comments like, it would cost a fortune to build a building like this. So we find ourselves as a congregation with an almost 90-year-old stone structure. And in many ways, we are defined by this building. You see, I'm a pastor, and people often ask me what I do for a living, right? And I say I'm a pastor, and guess what the very next question is? Where? And I say First Baptist Church in Muncie. And right away, people say, oh, I've been to a wedding there, right? Or, is that the building behind the library, the big limestone building? Yeah. You see, we are, for better or for worse, identified with this building, First Baptist Church in Muncie. And we might find ourselves asking the question, why did they build a building like this back in the 1920s? Certainly the world was very different in 1927, wouldn't you agree? But this is when construction started on this building. It took them 2 years. They didn't finish it until 1929. And then most of us know what happened in 1930, right? They had no idea. Bill Lidson was telling me this week, the offerings in this church dropped to a seventh of what they had been in 1930, not long after they had built this building. They had no idea when they built this building is that it would be foreclosed on in 1938. You see, they had no idea. Regardless, though, they wanted to build a structure, a beautiful, visible structure of worship in Muncie. And even today, this building still serves that purpose. But our world has drastically changed in the last 90 years. And this is what we're going to be talking about as we move into the summer. We're going to be reflecting on the ways in which our church has changed, the way in which our culture around it has changed. And we need to consider this building, this noun building. How are we called by God to utilize this building? How might God be shifting the way in which we use this building? A few years ago, I was finishing up my doctorate at Northern Seminary, and as a part of the process, my dissertation supervisor came for a site visit, and he came and stayed in our home, and I brought him here to the church, and we walked around the building, and certainly he was impressed by our building, but we also walked around the neighborhood. We walked down here, and at that time, the Open Door Clinic had not yet opened, but they had plans for that, so I was explaining to him what the Open Door Clinic was going to be. We walked around to the south side of our building, and we showed him where the Better Way was. I showed him where the YWCA was, and as he was certainly impressed by our building, he was more impressed by our location. He said, boy, you guys have quite an opportunity to impact this neighborhood. You guys, he said, are in a perfect location for ministry. And he used the phrase, he said this about our building. He says, you guys can be a building on mission for God in this neighborhood. I'll come back to that in just a moment, but I think we might want to think about how we're challenged as a congregation to discern the purpose and the use of the building that we've been given. In January, we met as a church coordination team to talk about the summer, and one of the projects that we are considering this year, along with a sabbatical, is this capital campaign. We're going to have a business meeting on May the 7th regarding this, but we're going to talk about improvements that need to be made to our building. And one thought was, as we began talking about this, was to postpone the building improvements, talking about our building improvements, until after the sabbatical. But as we began to discern the movement of the Spirit, we discerned that the issue of building improvements is not in contrast to what we're talking about this summer. In fact, it is right in line with what we're talking about this summer. James Martin, one of our a person who was on the CCT up until this year as an archaeologist, and he was researching grants that could be used for building improvements. And he discovered, and many of us already knew this, but that our church is on the National Historic Registry. And he told us that the outside of our building is considered to be a part of our community. And if we wanted to change the exterior of our building, we couldn't do it, even though we own the church. If we wanted to paint our church pink, we couldn't do it, right? Because the outside of our building, not that that's a good idea, but the outside of our building, hey, that's like the barns going up to Taylor, right? Taylor students, the pink, farm over there. We could do that. But we couldn't do it. Why is that? And he said, because the outside of our building belongs to the community. I love that, don't you? That whole idea of thinking about our building belonging to our community. Might we consider that our building is not just ours, it's really a part of our community? Might we consider that we might need to be even more intentional about giving our building away to our community? So, building as a noun. We've talked about that. Let's talk a minute about building as a verb. In a culture that seems to no longer be building church buildings, at least in the same way that they did in the past, we have an historic and extravagant building. As a part of our identity, for better or for worse, it is a part of who we are. We believe, as leaders in this church, that God has provided this building, that God has provided this location for us, but we have more to discern about what that means for us. Now, building as a verb, let's talk about a verb. This is one definition. To construct something, typically something by putting parts or material together over a period of time. So you think in terms of building like a structure. But here's a second definition that I think is even more pertinent. To establish and develop a business, relationship, or situation over a period of time. Now I like that verb definition a little bit better. And as we think about the word building, we are considering that we are, as a congregation, to be building something. Not just a physical building, but building relationships in our community. Perhaps God would be calling us to do that, to build. And we're going to talk about that more next week as we talk about community, as we talk about presence. All of this will kind of come together. But it's worth noting that Paul uses this concept of building as a verb to talk about what God is doing through Jesus and through the establishment of the church. Allow me to show you just a few verses where he's talking about building. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, just before the verses about our bodies as being temples of God, Paul describes his work of ministry as a building. Look at 1 Corinthians 3:9. For we are co-workers in God's service. You are God's field, God's building. Now, Paul understands that the work of ministry as building, as a verb, is God's work. He says, by the grace of God, by the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as a wise builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should build with care. So he's telling us, be careful to build our foundation on Christ Jesus. Look what he says in verse 11. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Christ Jesus. And then he instructs the church at Corinth to build what will last. The eternal work of God, he says. Everything else is temporary except God's eternal work. Everything will be burned up with fire, Paul says, and only God's work will last. And so Paul tells us, you need to build, you need to invest in those things that will last. Now, you might look at our building, and I've often thought, when hundreds of years from now, if this city were to be in ruins, this building would still be here. It's a big stone building, right? And everything else could disintegrate around it, and there'd probably still at least be pillars here. I think of the people walking through ancient ruins. I think maybe one day people will be walking through the ruins of this building, right? But will this building be here in 2,000 years? Will it be here in 10,000 years? You think about that, probably not. Even this building, the one that's been here for 90 solid years, will not be here forever. It's still temporary, even though it might seem permanent in many of our minds. And the eternal work of God The eternal work of God is what's important, not the temporary resources of our building. Ultimately, we are building God's eternal work on the foundation of Jesus Christ. And this eternal work is not about this noun building. It's about building relationships. Now, there is a lot around this word building, right? Building is a noun, building as a verb. Let me summarize my thoughts in case it's been a little hard to follow this morning. Building, we have one, and we consider it a gift. And while we could debate about the essential role of a church building and the work of God in the world, we believe that God has granted us this building at 309 East Adams Street. And we believe that this building should serve God's work in this world. We believe that God's work in this world is not about this building, but is about building relationships with those around us, reaching outside of this building into our neighborhood, into our community. And we use our building to reach out. Do you realize how many groups use this building? I got an email not long ago, and I didn't know the person. She said, "You don't know me, but you need to know that you all at First Baptist Church are making a difference in this community." She said, and I don't know where she was from. I don't know what group she was connected to, but she said, "You're making a difference in this community." This baptistry is filled underneath here, and there's going to be a baptism service in here tonight. And it's not going to be our church. It's going to be another church that doesn't have a building. And they're coming in, they're going to use our building. They're going to baptize students here tonight. We have groups that meet during the week here. If you wander in our building on a Monday or Tuesday night, you'll see groups walking around here. And probably people that you will not see on Sunday morning, because our building is being used to help this community. Local agencies, other churches. There's a church group that is meeting, a new church plant that meets in our building on Sunday afternoons. One day there'll be a different church. They'll branch out. I'm not sure if they'll ever have a building, but they're using our building right now. You see, that's what it means to give our building away. That's what it means to use our building to connect with our neighborhood. Now, that doesn't replace the work that we're called to do as Christians in our community, but it is a part of who we are, and it's a part of how we as a congregation can use our resources to impact our neighborhood. Now, we'll ultimately talk more about this next week when we talk about the word community, and then we talk about the word presence following that. That's a lot to take in this morning. And you take that in, you might say, well, what does that have to do with me and my Christian walk this morning? You might be saying, right? Well, here's the deal. We are all a part of this kingdom of God, that God is building, that God is working. And we as a congregation, again, this has been kind of a family conversation this morning. If you're not a part of this church, if you just joined us this morning for the first time, you might feel a little disconnected from this sermon. But I think it's important that we as a congregation talk about who we are as First Baptist Church. And building is the first word that we've talked about. Maybe this morning, God would be prompting you in some way to say, God, how do you want to use me as a part of this congregation to impact this community? God, how can I maybe contribute to this structure? That's part of what it means to be faithful, to steward our resources. But beyond that, what might God, you be calling me to do in my neighborhood, in my school, in my office? How are you calling me to build the eternal things of God? We're going to take a few minutes here, and this band comes forward and sing a song of response. And I'd like to ask you to respond however God would be prompting you to respond. Maybe there's a particular need that you have and you want to come for prayer this morning. The altar's open, or you can come and pray with me. Maybe there's a decision you'd like to make this morning, and you want to come and make that decision. Is following Christ for the first time, or a decision to be baptized, you would come and do that now. Let's all stand together and sing.